Well, first of all, with State Parliament sitting on Spring Street, the laws to, take a tougher stance with people who trespass on farms have passed at last. That's some relief to your members, I'm sure.
Yeah, finally we have that bit of relief, hopefully this will make a difference. And now we need to see people utilising those fines when we have the breaking in and entering onto our properties.
And why, just for those who are not initiated, I guess, why do people break into farms? What is their reason for going in there? It's largely around the livestock sector?
Absolutely. I guess it's a form of protest. Animal activists, they want to jump into our properties. They think that somehow creates transparency for the public, essentially with an anti-animal agriculture sentiment. I suppose that they're using that form of protest, and we've said that trespass onto properties is never an acceptable type of protest, and there's ways to influence the community, but breaking into our homes and our businesses is not the way to go about it.
And I imagine there's also a biosecurity concern that arises if someone hasn't gone through the proper processes and just comes in amongst livestock. We've seen the recent concerns about Japanese encephalitis around pigs, for instance, an example of where those risks might arise.
Absolutely, and those biosecurity risks have always been a risk and in place, and now this is coupled with, there is a little bit of frustration from our perspective that you have to have a biosecurity plan in order for the trespass to be trespassed, but in any case, the government has used the opportunity to get more biosecurity plans on Victorian farms. It's a good practice to go through anyway, so the VFF is willing to assist through Agriculture Victoria in regards to these biosecurity plans that say you cannot enter without permission to enter onto a property, because there's all sorts of unintended consequences that can arise from that breach of biosecurity protocol.
Now, on another topic that's been kicking around federally is this issue of the agriculture visa. Looks like the federal government's having trouble securing a partner. The Nationals MP for Northwestern Victoria's Mallee seat, Anne Webster, said she's frustrated with the slow progress. Is the Farmers Federation frustrated as well?
Look, we're not only frustrated but getting very, very nervous because, of course, we're waiting for the moment that a federal election is called, and we think that there's a really big risk here that if there's not the mechanism in place before the election is called, that it potentially might fall by the wayside under a different government. So a lot of frustration. I guess from our perspective, we've been calling for this for a really long time and would have liked to have seen the coalition commit to it earlier and get some rubber on the road. Having said that, we do understand that we're not just talking about what Australia wants now. We're entering into, bilateral agreements with countries, and those countries have got conditions that have to be negotiated and worked through in order to get them signed up to that ag visa. So, yes, we're annoyed that it's taken this long, but there is some understanding that it's complicated and we now need to get those, ASEAN nations to sign up to it. And hopefully when we sign up the first one, and my understanding is that we're getting quite close, with one country, that we'll see some momentum around those other countries coming on board too.
Well, Ms Webster, or Dr Webster, had asserted that maybe even the Australian Workers' Union had been directly undermining the process of getting an ag visa, lobbying countries not to sign up to one. I gather your concern is if nothing's locked in before a federal election, if there's a change of government, nothing will happen.
Absolutely. And I think, it's very disingenuous for the unions to get out front and to start talking about, exploitation on farms and how that's a problem. Whilst no one is in favour of exploitation, and the industry itself has been saying we need to have mechanisms in place to stamp that out, we need to have protections in place for migrant workers, for unions to get there and to say that, it's to protect people from other nations is disingenuous. They have a very false assumption that this is about a way to protect Australian jobs. And what we know in our industry is that if we don't have migrants that are part of the industry, working in our fields, picking and packing fruit and vegetables, that you lose or you put at risk all of the Australian jobs in the supply chain. And those workers that are coming are protected under Australian law. They are, they're due to be paid Australian wages, and they're absolutely vitally important to the Australian economy. So that's been disappointing to hear that that's some of the things that have been going on. But yeah, I'm really hopeful that, in the next few weeks we're going to see the first country sign on.
And when it comes to, farm safety, I know the Farmers Federation is very strong on this front. Does it put a farmer's safety at risk if they simply have to get the work done and they don't have the workers? Is that an aspect of what happens if we don't secure the tens of thousands in horticulture alone for the next harvest?
Look, I suppose it is an aspect. I mean, we've seen that, particularly that farmer fatigue really setting in during, our management of the pandemic, where we've had workers in isolation and you've got people working around the clock. It's the same with the farm workers. You can't have people working 50, 60, 70 hours a week because there's a shortage of workers in the plant. There are so many consequences to not having enough workers, including that threat to our economy and our food security, which is something that we have taken for granted for a very long time. But if we want to see a thriving agricultural sector in this country, then we need to seriously consider the fact that we don't have enough workers. And so organisations like the unions putting roadblocks in the way to that is actually detrimental to every Australian in regards to the cost of food and living affordability. We need these workers here now. We've got such low unemployment rates to suggest that Australia will be able to get this work done by itself is ludicrous.
Now, Emma, lastly, I see in the federal budget, some leaks always come out before the federal budget. They've announced that they're going to spend $5 billion putting a dam at Hell's Gate near Townsville in Queensland to open up 60,000 hectares of agriculture. Given the federal government sort of walking into a state responsibility on dams, is there something like Murray-Darling, the Murray Basin Rail, that they maybe could be funding to get some help in for Victorian farmers as well?
Oh, look, we know that we're all very, very tired of state and federal politicians, essentially blaming, passing the buck, blaming each other. We see the politicisation of things like key infrastructure projects. We've just got to have an overarching strategy for things like how do we have water security, how do we bolster the Murray-Darling Basin and the plan itself in regards to water. That rail project, we've had commitment from the federal government, but no commitment from the state government. We need to have an overarching food security plan in this country. We cannot be, doing election cycle after election cycle considering these things. It's time for some bipartisanship around food security, input security, because the world is changing and we're going to sleepwalk ourselves into a position where food security is undermined in this country for no reason other than poor politics, to be frank. So I hope that's not another, the announcement is not another state versus federal game, and there are plenty of infrastructure projects that can be invested into from all levels of government that need to be considered, that have, state farming organisations, National Farmers Federation have put forward these key infrastructure projects, and we really need to see commitment around them, both in federal election, nationally, of course, and then in our state election in Victoria that's also coming up this year.
It just occurs to me to ask about fuel security with the cost of diesel. Do we need to be looking at the diesel fuel rebate level or some other way of helping farmers cope with the spike in the cost of diesel? It's
far from our corporate memory as Australians where there was a time where fuel was rationed, and we might potentially be looking at that sort of geopolitical disruption. I mean, we're seeing it already. We've seen those prices spike. But aside from just the price of fuel, we also need that fuel security around the fact that it's going to be available when and if we need it. We know that the strategic reserve of fuel for Australia is actually located in the US, and it would take 3 to 4 weeks to actually get it here to Australia if we needed it. And you don't have to be that politically engaged to see that the world is changing, and those sorts of contingency plans, that sort of thinking needs to be applied to us now. Again, we cannot sleepwalk into a disaster just because of poor planning. So we're calling on the federal government to look at bringing that supply onshore as soon as possible, and we can't absorb all of these prices. There is no doubt that this has to transpire into an increase of the food prices on our supermarket shelves. We've all got to be part of this and wear this together. The resilience of the agricultural industry could never be as important as what it is now, probably since about, World War II. So we need to start considering things from that perspective. There's been some talk around removing the fuel excise tax on behalf of everybody. And I think that's a dangerous place for us to get to, because ultimately what we also need is for people to ration fuel in their own lives. We need those key infrastructure spends on public transport and things like that. So, we're not carpooling and be incentivising the community to actually reduce their use of fuel. At the same time, we have conversations about climate change. So we've actually got to be really holistic in our approach here as a country. And I'm sure that everybody would agree that having a food supply in Australia and a thriving agricultural industry is vitally important for everybody in Australia. We certainly just can't see a huge impost on farmers in regards to the cost of production, because it's no good for anyone.
Well, Emma, that's fascinating. I'd love to keep talking, but we've both got to keep moving on. Thanks very much for your time today.
No worries, anytime.